What's going on, folks? This is the first live I've ever done, so this is going to be interesting. Um, I want to talk about X-Men 97 episode 4. If you saw it, put your thoughts in as we're going down below. We're just going to kind of recap it and kind of go from there. I think just talking about it is going to be good. Just given my just given the first episode, I think it was not given the first episode. I don't even know what I'm saying. But this episode obviously was split into two parts. The first one being called Motendo, where it basically just focuses on Roberto da Costa and Jubilee. Obviously, it's Jubilee's 18th birthday. She wants to spend the day at the arcade, and Magneto, of course, clearly says no and feels like everyone should be training instead. Um, with that being said, Jubilee does end up getting, I guess, what she wanted, but not really. Somehow, this weird Motendo from Mojo got into her room, and her and Bobby get sucked into that universe and end up playing quote unquote video games, eventually going up against Mojo. Now, while I thought that this was a pretty cool episode in terms of kind of bringing back Mojo, bringing back the nostalgia of video games, early 90s, kind of like Nintendo-esque, it was it was good. It was okay, right? There was a lot of stuff that happened in that particular part of the episode. Meanwhile, it took up like the first two-thirds of the entire episode. Um, I think that it was interesting again to see Mojo. Mojo's fine. He's a wild and very interesting character, but Mojo I feel like is just kind of overdone and he's just kind of like a one-trick pony. And this is not me complaining about the episode. I thought it was another great episode for X-Men 97. I just think that Mojo, it's always the same thing. Like he's bringing people in to entertain his universe. And it's just always kind of the same thing. We're taking the X-Men and putting them through these certain situations where they fight other characters, and it's all just for entertainment, and the goal is to stop Mojo from doing it. While, again, I think that's a great, interesting plot, it's just the same thing over and over again, and I think it would have been a little bit better if it was somewhat different. The other thing that I'm just a little salty about in terms of Bobby, Roberto da Costa, is like we haven't really seen him do anything. Now, I get it, right? They're going to flesh out his character. There's clearly an issue with him having powers. Comes from a rich family, and he doesn't want his rich family to not like him, and he clearly doesn't want to be separated from currently his privileged life that he is used to living. And they're obviously going to flesh that out eventually. But I'm kind of just tired of like the rich pretty boy act. I don't think he was really like that in the comics. In fact, he was like ready to use his powers right away to kind of like get back for having his girlfriend be stolen from him. Obviously, this is adapted much differently. But I think that was like I'm ready to see him use his powers. Yes, he used his powers one time in this episode. And before anyone says that he used his powers, like I get it, right? He used his powers just one time, and they were like kind of hesitantly used in this episode. I just thought we would have gotten maybe a little bit more of like some sunspots, some action from him, and we just still haven't gotten that yet. That's kind of like my biggest issue with this whole episode. I still like this episode, and I really wish the next part, the life death part, be the whole thing that we saw between Storm and Forge was a little bit longer. Also, as we're going through, if you have like thoughts or comments, please put them down below. I'd love to like chat with people as they're going through. I think I know how this works. I'm hoping they'll just show up on screen. I don't know. This is my first time doing this again. But like the life death is two parts in the comics, if you don't know, and it's obviously between Storm and Forge. And while I feel like this first part, a lot of it obviously was squeezed into one episode and was probably really only like a third of the episode, a lot of stuff happened really fast. And it's not, again, exactly the same as the comics, nor should it be. I do think, though, that they did a decent job of fitting a decent amount of stuff in a very short amount of time. I probably would have liked it to be a little bit longer and probably would have seen a little bit less of the like Motendo part of the episode. Um, I just think that they put a lot in, and they clearly tried to flesh out who Forge is, especially if you don't know who he is and like his background. But you can see the romance between Storm and Forge just like starting. Get salty. I will get salty. Thank you. And then, yeah, the pixel art was cool. I thought it was pretty creative. I liked going back to kind of like that nostalgic look of like video games from the 90s. But back to like the life death part, I feel like it just didn't. They rushed a lot, and again, mind you, this is like over 2 issues, with the second issue being like a standard length comic issue. The first one was like a double comic issue basically. So there was a lot that happened. Um, and I just think that they forced a lot. Now there is another life death episode in the future, and I think it's the whole episode. So I do think that that one will be longer and will flesh out a little bit more. And I'm interested to see what they do, based on, because like they already ended the first comic, how they ended this episode. So it will be interesting to see if they have a whole episode for the shorter comic, of like Storm going through the plains of Africa basically, and like trying to find herself. Um, I just think that it was a kind of rushed with Forge, um, just a little bit. Yeah, in Forge's room there was a picture of the X Factor team, which I thought was cool. Um, I'm not sure if that doesn't mean that X Factor isn't existing. Who knows? Who knows what they're gonna do? Also, his house in this episode is vastly different than what we saw in um, in the comics, where it's way more futuristic, and sort of got that at the end of this episode, where like we saw that Storm had left. Spoilers, by the way, if you have not seen this. But Storm had left the house on the horse, and she was riding away, and then eventually like fell through the floor of the second floor and onto, I guess, the main floor in Forge's house. And that kind of sort of happened in the comics, because Forge basically has his house where he can create any kind of environment for the most part. And like Storm is angry and tries to leave, but she gets caught up in all of the different environments by hitting some like remote, probably that she shouldn't have, and ends up like falling, and like Forge is trying to go after her to make sure she doesn't hurt herself, all this stuff. And that kind of seemed like that happened. We also get an introduction to the adversary, who is obviously depicted, at least in this episode, as like a big bird hawk kind of thing, which he kind of looks like that in the comics. I don't know if he takes on different forms, but he's there was no explanation to him. And that's, if you don't know about the adversary from comics, that can be kind of like jarring, and like, what the heck is happening right now in this episode? Obviously that will get explained more in future episodes, but basically the adversary is like a future mystical entity who basically usually just like plays tricks on people to get his way, essentially. At first, I thought it was like a one of the wraiths that is somewhat connected with Forge and like somewhat of his mystical powers that we do end up seeing later on in the comics, with how like Storm does get her powers back. So I thought it was a wraith initially at first, and I guess it still could be, because they take on. I could be wrong in this. If someone knows, go ahead and correct me. They like take on other people's, or other beings, like what do I want to say, like physical being. And so it could be slightly confusing. It might be a wraith. Who knows? Who knows what's happening? But I do think that introducing the adversary obviously is like somewhat of a cliffhanger, but also somewhat jarring at the end of the episode. I do think that they put a lot in. They like fit in the whole first Life Death comic, which was like 60 pages, into into like 12 minutes of an episode. In the comics, the adversary is a mystical chicken. Yeah, pretty close, and that's almost looked like that. Geeky old hawk almost looked like that. He looked just more like a hawk, though, to be honest. Um, but yeah, I think in the comics, from what I've seen, he's like depicted as like this bird-looking character. Um, Again, I just felt like that was jarring, and obviously there was no like extra background given to him. Again, probably as like a cliffhanger. I don't know. Um, it will be interesting to see where they go with that. And I do think the next life death episode, like I said, is a whole episode of just that maybe. Um, and I still think that's interesting. However, they could, I guess, maybe combining that second life death issue where Storm is crossing the plains of Africa, as well as her maybe reconnecting with Forge, and then that whole of like him helping her get her powers back. Um, I will link that video, by the way, if you want to actually learn in the comics how Storm does get her powers back with the help of Forge. It is just like kind of interesting. He's like, I'll just make this thing that will, get your powers back. Pretty plain and simple. I think the biggest thing that that's very interesting that I've seen so far is like causing controversy is like, do people are blaming not Storm, Forge for Storm's loss of her powers. I would love to know where people stand on that. In one sense, I can understand that as like the being as to why he or like Storm lost her powers, but he didn't. Yeah, Forge used to be a shaman in the past. I don't think you're wrong in that. He does have some sort of like mystical powers, from my understanding, and that has to do with like some sort of like wraith storyline after the life death issue, and like how it's very confusing. A lot of stuff is happening in the comics that I don't think will get fully fleshed out in these episodes. But I do think that like it will. I forget where I was. I forget what I was talking about. I do think that people were blaming Forge for Storm losing her powers, while he did create some sort of this technology to be used to drain mutants' powers. He wasn't the one that like shot Storm, right? And he wasn't going to be the one that shot Magneto. While yes, he did create that technology, and of course it would be like very naive of him to be not think that it might not get used in a bad way, right? Especially with the U.S. government and knowing that usually they don't like mutants to begin with. So I think it is interesting to see that people are blaming Forge. I think they're more mad at Forge for basically lying to Storm of like, oh, I want to help you. And he really wants to help her because he feels guilty for her losing her powers. And obviously in all of this, they start to, build feelings for each other. So I think that's really my qualms with the issue. Not to be like negative, I still thought it was a great great episode. I enjoyed it. Should 97 be just a cartoon version of the comic exactly? No, I don't think so. I think it should be more of an adaptation. Like I'm not expecting it to be the exact same thing, and that's why I think them adapting / I do think if it was the exact comic, I do think that it really wouldn't be necessarily entertaining. Not that the comics aren't entertaining, but I don't think it would be as entertaining to a broader audience, right? Because I feel like us comic folks are very special, a very special breed, right? Um, and there's a lot of weird stuff that happens in comics that I think, people see that happen in movies and they're like, what is this? This is weird. Like, why is this even happening? Where like in the comics, we read it and we're like, this is like standard comic fare. Like just wild stuff happens here. Like, get over yourself. I don't know what you're expecting. Like weird stuff happens in the comics. And to not expect it happen in like some of these adaptations of TV shows and movies, I think people get kind of like weirded out. I like that theory. That's not a bad theory. Science, they simplified Inferno. Maybe she will defeat the bird and this will cause her to gain confidence back. Very possible. However, it still seems like she lost her what do I want to say, her actual ability to conjure weather, right? So she has to figure that out, which does happen again in the comics. And she does get her confidence back in that second life death kind of issue, which I really do hope that they somewhat adapt in this show because, again, I don't think that the show or movie should be an exact replica of comics. I think that would get boring for a lot of people. And then changing it up, even for the people who do know the comics, I think is exciting and fun. I just think that that change would be interesting. I do wonder where they're going to go with the adversary. Now this is like a big, not big. What do I want to say? This happens a little bit later, like after she kind of like roams the plains of Africa, from my understanding. So it'll be interesting to find out what they do in the future. Thank you everyone for watching. I don't have much more time left to spend here, unfortunately. I have, actual other things to do, slash wife and kiddo will be home soon. So, got to spend some time with them. Appreciate you watching, commenting, taking the time out of your day really to watch me just ramble about episode 4 of X-Men 97. Thank you so much. A life. Yeah, I know. It's weird. It's weird to have one of those, right? I will be watching your latest video, Geeky Old Hog, with Longbox Punk. 2 hours. I'm a little upset that oh, I hit my mic. I'm a little upset that we didn't go that long. But anyway, I will watch it at some point, probably later tonight. We're supposed to actually have a snowstorm tomorrow, which stinks, but that means more time to watch that and read some comics and do some other stuff. Until then, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks for watching. See you in the next round. How do we end this? Clearly, this is my first time doing this because I don't know how to end it. There we go. End.